Good evening. I'm so disappointed that I'm not there with you. The series of events scheduled for the next 3 days looks lovely, and I am especially disappointed that I'm not there to gather with you. But I do welcome this opportunity to share some preliminary thoughts on Toni Morrison's exploration of the relationship between care, healing, and the possibilities for justice. Reading Morrison always brings me much needed clarity, and that is no less the case in these uncertain times. What I share with you this evening is part of a larger project that considers the ways African American writers have explored notions of mercy, grace, justice, and other such values. While none of the authors I consider posit a system of ethics per se, their work does bear witness to the ethics that emerge from the communities about which they write. And among all the writers I engage, Toni Morrison seems the most committed to and consistent in presenting the ethical dimensions of Black life in the United States. Consequently, she is central to my intellectual project, both as subject and as inspiration. And I can say that the same is true of her role in the rest of my life as well. Morrison is most often thought of as a writer whose creative project seeks to call our attention to and to dismantle racist language, to present alternative meanings and worldviews as posited in the languages of the marginalized and dispossessed communities who are most often the subjects of her fiction. She has done so by focusing on the ways those communities are shaped by and respond to white supremacy, without centering white people or writing in view of what she calls the white gaze. In the later years of her life, she began to emphasize that her project included an effort to try and find a language for goodness. Literary language, she insisted, is most often devoted to evil and to the corrupt. In lectures at Harvard and Santa Cruz universities, and at a public conversation at Cornell University, as well as in an essay that was published after her death in the New York Times, she stressed this aspect of her literary project, saying, "Writing and trying to find language for goodness is all I have ever done in the novel." From her earliest work, Morrison has portrayed what I refer to as an ethic of care that governs the best of the communities about which she writes. I borrow this term, ethic of care, from feminist theorists such as Carol Gilligan and others who called our attention to the ways that people within communities depend upon one another, and who insisted that the most vulnerable members of community deserve special care and consideration. According to this mode of thinking, care is an ethical issue that can and should govern how we behave in community. While Gilligan has been criticized for the essentialist implications of her theory, which claim that women act or behave in ways that emphasize empathy or compassion, I nonetheless find the notion of an ethics of care useful when divorced from notions of inherent gender differences. For instance, most recently, ethics of care has been taken up by the field of disability studies. Eva Furter-Kitty notes, quote, "Care is an indispensable and even central good, one without which a life of dignity is impossible, and which is itself an expression of a person's dignity. The ability of a being to give and receive care is a source of dignity for humans no less than our capacity for reason," she says. As such, I find the concept of care useful for discussing one of the primary concerns of Morrison's fiction. Throughout her body of work, her concern with an ethics of care will develop further into explorations of those efforts and the pursuit of justice, an exploration that finds its fullest expression in her late fiction and her assertion that her work has been motivated by a concern with goodness. She writes, "Over time, these last 40 years, I have been more and more invested in making sure acts of goodness, however casual or deliberate or misapplied or blessed, produce language. Even when not articulated, such acts must have a strong impact on the novel's structure and its meaning. Expressions of goodness are never trivial or incidental in my writing. I want them to have life-changing properties and to illuminate decisively the moral questions embedded in the narrative. What she does not say is that these expressions of goodness are often guided by an ethics of care. A brief tour through two earlier works helps us to appreciate the development of her thought in this regard. While Gilligan saw the ethics of care as distinct from an ethics of justice, Morrison's work asks us to consider the relationship between the two. Now, readers of Morrison may recall that early in her first novel, The Bluest Eye, which was published in 1970, the narrator, the girl Claudia, recalls having a cold as a child. At first, she thinks her mother is angry at her for having gotten ill. She later realizes that her mother is angry at the illness itself, and this is a point upon which Morrison will elaborate in later works. Looking back, Claudia reconsiders. But was it really like that? As painful as I remember. Love, thick and dark as Alaga syrup, eased up into the cracked window. I could smell it, taste it, sweet, musty, with an edge of wintergreen in its base. Everywhere in that house. It coated my chest, along with the salve, and when the flannel came undone in my sleep, the clear, sharp curves of air outlined its presence on my throat. And in the night, when my coughing was dry and tough, feet padded into the room, hands repinned the flannel, readjusted the quilt, and rested a moment on my forehead. So when I think of autumn, I think of somebody with hands who does not want me to die. Here, love is equated with care, and care is life-giving and affirming. The language here is elevated and sensual. The metaphors are quotidian, yet rich. Alaga syrup is thick and syrupy sweet, a treat that turns biscuits or other breads into a dessert-like treat. To claim something good and loving as dark is notable in this novel, which reveals the destructive nature of white supremacy that claims darkness for all things evil and bad. Here, love itself is thick and dark. The young girls who are recipients of this kind of care, especially during times of illness, freely give it to others in need. When the foster child, Piccola, comes to live with them, we hear that she came with nothing, no little paper bag with the other dress, or a nightgown, or two pairs of whitish cotton bloomers. She just appeared with a white woman and sat down. This abandoned child doesn't even have a black mother or aunt to accompany her. Claudia's family, the McTeers, quietly take her in, feed her, give her shelter, a place to sleep, maternal and sisterly care. Claudia says, Frida and I stopped fighting each other and concentrated on our guests, trying hard to keep her from feeling outdoors. The two sisters agree, together, to take care of Piccola. They enact an ancient hospitality by treating their guests well, making her comfortable, giving her a sense of home. In this case, in order to counter the trauma of being thrown out of her home. They make her laugh and feed her graham crackers and milk, and they ask nothing of her in return. The young girls grow in their effort to comfort and care for Piccola. They are nurtured in love and governed by an ethic of care, and they are transformed by the act of caring for one in need of it. Unfortunately, the McTeer home is the only place where Piccola receives such care. Outside of that space, she falls victim to white supremacist notions of beauty and value, which are so internalized by her community that she becomes their victim first, and then ultimately the victim of the most heinous crime, incest at the hands of her father. There is no call for justice for Pecola. The crimes for her go unpunished. The care given her, not enough to address the causes of her trauma. The Bluest Eye makes no mention of the pursuit of justice for Pecola, and by novel's end, she is utterly defeated and destroyed. By mid-career, Morrison begins to suggest that there may be a relationship between an ethics of care and a pursuit of justice. In her third novel, Song of Solomon, published in 1977, she explores the meaning of and quest for justice. Throughout the text, she is interested in the nature of justice and its relationship to vengeance and history, retribution, and repair. Significantly, in this novel, most of the discussions about justice take place between the novel's men, especially in all male spaces. The first, most explicit discussion occurs in a barbershop. The narrator tells us, a young Negro boy had been found stomped to death in Sunflower County, Mississippi. There were no questions about who stomped him. His murderers had boasted freely, and there were no questions about the motive. The boy had whistled at some white woman, refused to deny he had slept with others, and was a Northerner visiting the South. His name was Till. This statement does a great deal of work. It declares a kind of matter-of-factness about the murder. It is spoken like it is a common occurrence. There is no mystery to be solved. The culprits are known. They feel neither remorse nor guilt. In fact, they are boastful. They do not fear arrest, trial, or conviction. The passage ends with a brief sentence. His name was Till. This situates the narrative temporally. The dialogue that follows occurs in the shadow of Emmett Till's murder in August 1955. Till is the young, black 14-year-old from Chicago who, while visiting family in Mississippi, is falsely accused of molesting a white woman whose husband and brother-in-law brutally beat and murder him. Till's death offers a rich opportunity for the men gathered in the barbershop. The conversation that ensues illustrates the diversity of opinion and ideology in the black community. The more conservative speaker almost blames the teenager for provoking his own death. His open defiance of the rules and norms governing contact between black men and white women constitute a refusal to stay within the confines that the Jim Crow South has set for black people. Another man counters by noting that Till was murdered for daring to act like a man. The end of the conversation leaves us with two questions. Is it possible to be black and a man in the United States? And what constitutes masculinity? Is survival an act of cowardice? No matter their politics, each man knows that his black skin constitutes guilt in the eyes of whites, and that they are vulnerable to any vigilante white without remorse to justice. The very arbitrariness of white power is what makes it so frightening. At any given moment, in any given place, they too might share Till's fate. Guitar, a militant young black man, a member of a vigilante group that seeks eye for eye justice, articulates an argument based in historical truth of justice denied. And this is what makes his argument both compelling and frightening. He says, "We poor people, milkman. I work in an auto plant. The rest of us barely eke out a living. Where's the money, the state, the country to finance our justice? You say Jews try their catches in court. Do we have a court? Is there one courthouse in one city in the country where a jury would convict them? There are places right now where a Negro still can't testify against a white man, where the judge, the jury, the court are legally bound to ignore anything a Negro has to say. What that means is that a black man is a victim of a crime only when a white man says he is. Only then." Reading this in an era when the murders of black Americans, Trayvon Martin, Alton Sterling, Mike Brown, and too many more, Walk Free, asserts the ongoing truth of guitar's assertion. Morrison demonstrates the persistence of injustice through time and place, the past and present, north and south. The only justice her male characters can imagine is vengeance. Most advocate survival over revenge, and in so doing, they forego seeking justice. But in the novel, Morrison offers another possibility, in the figure of an elderly servant named Circe, a midwife who lives in the ruins of a plantation mansion. She is a subversive agent who undermines everything her white employers lived for and died for. She is over 100 years old, and her face is a map of wrinkles. After the murder of their father, Macon Dead Sr., Circe, a servant in the Butler household, rescues, hides, and takes care of his two children, Macon Dead Jr. and Pilot. She takes from the Butler's wealth made by slavery and then by stealing the land of freedmen to care for the orphaned children of one of their victims. She feeds them, provides them shelter and love, hides them from harm, and sends them on their way. She is kind, but not coddling. She told them to stay until they could all figure out what to do, someplace for them to go. Their problem becomes her problem. She, quote, would bring them food, water to wash in, and she would empty their slop jar, end quote. She enacts an ethic of care that helps ensure their well-being and their ability to become self-sufficient individuals. Circe guides the novelist protagonist, Milkman, to seek his family's history and his own identity. She is healer, nurturer, protector. She is skilled in the uses of medicinal herbs and other natural remedies. Milkman thinks, quote, healer, deliverer. In another world, she would have been head nurse at Mercy Hospital. As with Homer's Circe, Morrison serves as Milkman's escort and guide to the spirits of the dead. She fills in the story of his family. She sends him further south where he will encounter his ancestors. She is healer, but she's also a justice seeker. She helps to bring a long-term sense of justice into being. It is not justice for those who were the immediate recipients of harm, nor does it punish those who caused the harm, but it helps to create a more just society for the progeny of both. Morrison Circe is keeper of the past. She marks the path. With their large column mansion, the Butlers laid claim to a classical past, but Morrison assures that it is the enslaved whose roots are more ancient than Eden and whose progeny will reach into the present. In naming Circe for Homer's bewitching seductress, Morrison calls attention to the relationship between that text and her own, and in so doing, she questions the quest of the Odyssey with all of its plunder, booty, traffic in women, slavery, and seeking a return that will reestablish the order of the patriarchy. She juxtaposes this Homeric version of the quest narrative with a quest that will yield a suppressed history, that will narrate the lives of those who have been victims of the West, and thoroughly question the patriarchy by insisting on a reconstructed masculinity at the narrative's end. Circe explains, they love this place, loved it, they loved it, stole for it, lied for it, killed for it, but I'm the only one left, me and the dogs, and everything in this world they live for will crumble and rot. What doesn't rot on its own, she allows the dogs to destroy. And she says, I want to see it all go, make sure it does go, and that nobody fixes it. There will be no romantic plantation tours of the Butler place. Circe does not act out of a love for whiteness, nor out of loyalty. Neither does she act out of revenge. She lives for a patient sense of justice, a kind of divine retribution, and for the return of the black sun. She gains pleasure not by killing, but by watching what white people loved destroy and rot, by watching their monument to history decay from within and bearing witness to its ruin. In Song of Solomon, Morrison explores the potential of retributive justice, which she rejects in favor of a long-term divine justice toward which the universe bends. She also introduces the ethic of care and suggests a relationship between the ethic of care and the pursuit of justice. She will fully develop this in her later novels. In God Help the Child, published in 2015, Morrison portrays two self-absorbed young adults who fully develop their sense of humanity when they come together to care for an infirmed elder. The act of bathing her becomes a spiritual practice, what Morrison calls an act of devotion. She tells us, quote, "They work together like a true couple, thinking not of themselves, but of helping somebody else." But it is in the novel that precedes this one, Home, published in 2012, that Morrison turns fully to an exploration of the relationship between an ethics of care and its potential for achieving a kind of restorative, or better yet, a kind of transformative justice. I should say here that Morrison does not represent restorative justice as a process, but instead suggests that it might be a guiding principle of a society governed by an ethic of care. There is nothing that can make up for crimes against her victimized characters. At best, they can learn how to live, how to survive, how to be healed. They are not cured, but they can go on and do some good in the world. In her model, the offender is not reconciled with the victim, but the victim is cared for and embraced by community. And witnessing this, the victim's brother, who in another instance has been an offender himself, must come to terms with the trauma he has caused, and rather than continue to be paralyzed by it, he must do something ethically productive, indeed good. As a result, at the novel's end, a victimizer and a victim are transformed. Set in the 1950s United States during the height of McCarthyism, Home is the story of the Korean War veteran Frank Money. Living in the Pacific Northwest and suffering from post-traumatic stress, Frank receives word that his younger sister C is in harm's way in Georgia, and he sets out on a cross-country trek to rescue her. C has been working as a domestic servant in the home of a white doctor, Beauregard Scott, and his wife. Unbeknownst to C, Scott is a eugenicist who, quote, occasionally performs abortions on society ladies, end quote. And like the so-called father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims, he sets out to improve the speculum and in the process mutilates a number of pure black women. C quickly becomes victim to Scott's experimentations, and her suffering is so extreme that the house's other domestic servant reaches out to Frank and aids him when he comes to rescue his sister. Frank carries his sister in his arms until they are able to hire a hack to take them to the small town of their childhood, Lotus, Georgia. And there he hands her over to Miss Ethel and a band of local women who set out to heal her. Morrison writes, quote, once they knew she had been working for a doctor, the eye-rolling and tooth-sucking was enough to make clear their scorn, end quote. At no point does anyone call the police, nor do they issue a complaint against a medical board. These are not options that will do C any good. They won't render justice in her case. Instead, the women go about treating her illness, and then helping her to heal and become a fully grown woman amongst them. At first, they tend to her bodily wounds. When Frank first takes C to Miss Ethel, the older woman pulls up C's uniform and parts her legs. She says, "Have mercy. She's on fire." The women then take turns providing medicinal herbs and potions for her, and the final stage for her healing includes being sun-smacked, which means spending at least 1 hour a day with her legs open to the blazing sun. Each woman agreed that this embrace would rid her of any kind of womb sickness. This they see not only as giving her access to the healing powers of the sun, but also providing a permanent cure, the kind beyond human power. The 10 days exposed to the sun is a ritual, a transition, an absorption of the energy to combat evil and harm. And at the end of 2 months in their care, quote, C was different. 2 months surrounded by country women who love mean had changed her. The women handled illness as though it were an affront, an illegal invading braggart who needed whipping. They didn't waste their time or the patient's time with sympathy, and they met the tears of the suffering with contempt. Just like the caregiver in the bluest eye, so too do these women confront enemy as an illness that they must vanquish. Their care is without sentiment or even sympathy, and it certainly holds no pity. But as C heals from their potions and their food, they change tactics. They bring her embroidery and crocheting, and finally, when she's ready, they invite her to their quilting circle. They incorporate her, and they teach her. When she is healed to their liking, Miss Ethel tells her, "Look to yourself. You free. Nothing and nobody is obliged to save you but you. Seed your own land. You young and a woman, and there's serious limitation in both, but you a person too. Don't let some trifling boyfriend, and certainly no devil doctor, decide who you are. That's slavery. Somewhere inside of you is that free person I'm talking about. Locate her and let her do some good in the world." Freedom lies not in her social condition, but in her self-perception. In the posthumously titled Goodness, Morrison says she identifies the women's work to heal C as an instant of innate group compassion. She asserts, quote, "It was important to me to give that compassion voice." And in so doing, she marks it as significant, worthy of our attention. To highlight this act of goodness, the women's ethic of care gives C herself, transformed, wounded but standing strong. The doctor's experiments have rendered her infertile, and as with many of her contemporary black and poor women in the South, she has been sterilized without her knowledge or her consent. She carries the burden of that loss with her, and yet she leaves these women stronger, economically self-sufficient, and no longer in need of her brother's rescuing. He notices, quote, "This C was not the girl who trembled at the slightest touch of real and vicious world, nor was she even the 15-year-old who would run off with the first boy who asked her. And she was not the household help who believed that whatever happened to her while drugged was a good idea because a white coat told her so. Frank didn't know what took place during those weeks at Miss Ethel's house, surrounded by those women with seen-it-all eyes. They delivered unto him a C who would never again need his hand over her eyes or his arms to stop her murmuring bones." In Home, there is no justice for what Dr. Scott has taken from C. In fact, it is unlikely that what he did was even counted as a crime. In her recent Intimate Justice, The Black Female Body and the Body Politic, political theorist Shatima Threadcraft reminds us that black women who suffered forced sterilization at the hands of the state are largely responsible for the shift in feminist language from a right to abortion to reproductive rights. So pervasive was the practice that it became commonplace and was nicknamed a Mississippi appendectomy. And it was legal. And when one of the victims, Elaine Riddick, finally seeks justice 43 years later, Threadcraft wonders, quote, "What in this instance does justice require?" The project of intimate justice, she writes, is still incomplete. There is no justice-demanding movement for C, just a community of women who heal her wounds, teach her how to incorporate her physical and emotional scars into the woman she has become, and send her off. They incorporate her into their community, hold not just the doctor but the whole medical establishment accountable, and vow to do all they can to keep themselves and those for whom they care out of any entanglements with doctors, hospitals, and the like. They model a kind of behavior and an ethical practice that lays the foundation for her transformation. They seek not to incorporate her victimizer because he is pure evil, and yet their community can and does offer healing to those who have victimized others. As we learn, part of Frank's mental trauma is a result of his own horrific action during his time in Korea. He is broken from the guilt he bears. Returning to Lotus to rescue his sister, an act of brotherly love and goodness, restores him as well. Before returning to home, he sees the world in black and white, but once he has delivered his sister, he notices, quote, "It's so bright, brighter than he remembered it." He begins to see color, clarity, and appreciation for the world's beauty return to him after he cares for his sister, after he risks himself to save her, after he acts out of love for her. Restorative justice advocate Dr. Fania Davis, building upon Dr. Martin Luther King, says, quote, "Justice is love correcting that which stands against love." And she asks, how do we heal from structural and interpersonal trauma, end quote. Healing is necessary to stop the cycle of harm, healing individuals as well as communities. Morrison suggests that the very act of putting stories of suffering on display is necessary for the acquisition of justice. Restorative justice seeks to offer repair, to put things as they should be. Many progressive thinkers and activists have argued for restorative justice to replace the punitive paradigm which governs so much of American society. But recently, some others are beginning to turn from restoration to transformation. Activist and scholar Zahir Ali writes, "If things are restored back to the way they used to be, to the same arrangements of power, the same relationships, the same mindsets, is that really justice?" But if we think about transformative justice as a means by which to create a space that allows people to exercise agency to make new and better decisions in their lives, maybe that's closer to justice. As a form, the novel is a place that raises questions about the possibilities and goals of justice. It allows us to imagine what a society governed by an ethics of care, a society devoted to restoring and repairing those who have been harmed, giving them space for transformation, what that society might look like. It is not easy. It does not offer the possibility of a cure, but it encourages healing. The scar is still there. It becomes part of a new person who is scarred but not broken, who is guided by, treated with love and care, and who can go on living productive lives devoted to goodness and ceasing the cycle of harm. In a joint interview with her sister Fania, activist philosopher Angela Davis says, "I think that restorative justice is really a really important dimension of the process of living the way we want to live in the future, embodying it. We have to imagine the kind of society we want to inhabit. We can't simply assume that somehow, magically, we're going to create a new society in which there will be new human beings. No, we have to begin that process of creating the society we want to inhabit right now." This, I think, is in part the work of the novel, especially in Morrison's hands. Her fiction imagines worlds that were, and in so doing, provide a template for what might be. In the case of Home, it is a template for a just society guided by principles of love and care. And in Morrison's case, the achieving of justice seems secondary to the acquisition of self-knowledge. She asserts that a satisfactory or good ending for her is when the protagonist learns something vital and morally insightful that she or he did not know in the beginning. I wonder if the acquisition of self-knowledge, having learned something morally insightful, might not be the end result of a process of restorative justice. By novel's end, both Frank and C stand like the tree with which Morrison closes the novel, a sweet bay with olive green leaves, split down the middle. The final page contains a poem in the voice of Frank, and it seems a good place for us to close as well. I stood there a long while, staring at that tree. It looked so strong, so beautiful, hurt right down the middle, but alive and well. C touched my shoulder lightly. Frank? Yes. Come on, brother. Let's go home. Thank you.